Hi everyone, my name is Jennifer Milikowsky. I'm a joint MBA Master of Forestry student at Yale University, so the School of Management and the School of Forestry. And I'm here to talk about Yale's new initiative, our carbon charge program. I was a student representative on the task force. Really briefly, just for the students in the room, this is also a story of encouraging you to really try to take action on your campus and to empower you to try to see some change that you think should really happen. This task force certainly came about because of the efforts of a lot of people, but one of the initial things about it was that I was working with Professor Bill Nordhaus on a completely separate Earth Day event last year, and he's sort of in his talks or offhandedly mentioned that he thought this might be something that could work. And I sort of heard that, and I did not let him forget it, and really pestered him about it, as well as a lot of other people, for a long time. So it was certainly not just my efforts, but I think student initiative does really go a long way, and I think that's very evident here. So I encourage you all to really keep that in mind. So in 2014, Yale University's president announced 6 new sustainability initiatives. So I won't go through all of them, but just note that the task force was one of them. And so this is really an effort that Yale's undertaking to really play a larger role in sustainability, but specifically I'm going to talk about the task force. I think it really highlights that this is not sort of we don't consider it sort of the one solution. It's not a sort of solve everything, but it's a really exciting part of sort of this whole package of sustainability initiatives that together could be really meaningful. So what were we tasked to do? We were really tasked to determine whether a carbon charge could be introduced at Yale. And if so, what's a blueprint for its design? What does that mean? You know, it's a little easier to understand how a carbon tax works on a federal level or even a state level. And we're fortunate enough to work with Professor Bill Nordhaus, who's one of the sort of leading experts on that concept. But what would this look like in a university setting? We also wanted to make sure that we were providing incentives for units to reduce their carbon footprint, but doing so in a way that wasn't administratively or economically burdensome. Yale really wants to take a lead in sustainability, wants to have a big impact, but at the same time we have to keep in mind that our core mission is really to educate and do research, and we can't sort of lose sight of that mission in trying to do this. I think it's also important to keep in mind that we also should provide incentives for different units to reduce their carbon footprint. I think that's really important to highlight. This program is not designed to raise revenue. So a lot of taxes people think about as a means of raising revenue, and that's really not what this was about. This was about trying to reduce carbon footprint, and that'll come up later as well. So we wanted to examine programs that have been implemented in other organizations. There have been some for-profit companies that have looked into this. And we also wanted to take advantage of the fact that we were at Yale. There are all these really smart people doing incredible research around this topic. We wanted to make sure we were using those resources to our advantage. And we needed to report quickly. We needed to not drag our feet because we really wanted to get this off the ground and running and have some sort of pilot in place for next year. So this is just an sample of the members. I just wanted to include this because it's a real mix of people. There are 3 students involved. There's facilities. There's the sustainability office. There were economics professors. There were deans of various colleges. It was a really diverse group of people, and I think that was part of the reason why we were very successful and we got a lot done, and we were able to really please a lot of different constituents at the university. So I think it was a great example of the university really coming together. And I question whether it would have been as effective if it was purely sort of a sustainability office initiative that then was placed on the whole university. It certainly felt more like the university created this for the university. And I think the student involvement was also really important. There were 3 of us who were on it. There was an undergrad, a PhD student, and then I was the master's student representative. So we had representation across the student body. We held a student forum where we gave students the opportunity to provide input. Both if they couldn't make it, they could submit it online. But we also had an incredible discussion and conversation for about 2 hours one evening right in the middle of planning with students. So it was really important, I think, for students to feel like they were a part of this process. Students at Yale have certainly been somewhat frustrated with communications with the university. There's been a lot of student angst about divestment, and that's been a big issue that's been in our student paper a lot and gotten a lot of attention. And so it was really important that this be an initiative that students played a very active role in and felt like they were getting their voices heard, and it was sort of a task that it was also really important for us to stress that we were really viewing this as not an alternative to divestment or any other sustainability initiative. It wasn't to take the place of anything. This was sort of an initiative in and of itself that was really focused on trying to trying to help Yale be a leader in how we can look at these issues creatively and be a little bit innovative in how we reduce our emissions. So just to really quickly go through the major recommendations, I want to make sure I leave time at the end for questions about process or what we found. But we did find that we should go forward and introduce a carbon charge that we were to phase in over 3 years. The price we set was the social cost of carbon, and I'll go into a little bit more detail as to why we chose that price, so about $40 a ton. One really important aspect of this program is that we decided that it should be revenue neutral at the university level, and so for all units taken together. So again, stressing that this is not a revenue generating program. It can be for individual units, but it will not be for the university as a whole. So I learned a lot about university administration and budgeting in this process, which is much more complicated than I could have ever imagined. And it was very clear that it was not going to go over well across the university if sort of the central administrative unit of the university was raising revenue through this program. You know, another sort of central administrative tax was not going to be well taken. So this program is going to be revenue neutral, meaning that some programs can gain and some programs will lose depending on their year-over-year emissions. But across the board, only units will exchange money amongst themselves. So the charge would initially be applied to net carbon emissions, so that there are 2 different ways we could have done this. We could have put pressure to decrease overall emissions year after year, and there was certainly some people advocating for that because overall the goal of the program is to decrease emissions. The thought, however, was that we wanted to help decrease emissions by incentivizing people to do it, and that it would be much easier to administer if we just simply took year-over-year emissions from adjusted for the overall trend, as opposed to putting this pressure that the whole university decrease. We just every year look at between units. And we can talk more about that. Essentially, it's helping people set a price so they can understand what the payback period is for certain initiatives, and it'll help people move forward with some projects without sort of overly burdening the units. So the one other complication of Yale being sort of so large and administratively complicated is that we happen to have a lot of buildings spread not just across the state but across the region, and we have financial stakes in some entities, and we have operational control over other entities. We just lease some buildings, we own some buildings, and so it can get really complicated to think of what is the base that this charge is going to cover. And so we realized early on that the simpler the charge, and so the simpler the blueprint, the better. As soon as we make this really complicated, it's going to be a lot easier for you to find critics of it and a lot easier for people to pick it apart. So the strategy was to make it as simple as possible, and the thought in doing that was that Yale should administer the charge whenever they had operational control, And the really simple way of looking at that is essentially whenever they pay the energy bill. So if the building was leased by Yale, and so they paid the energy bill under that lease, then that building would fall under the charge. However, investments, so things that Yale had some financial interest in but had zero operational control in, were outside the purview of this charge. It certainly does still get complicated because Yale has a significant number of medical buildings in which they do pay the energy bill for, but are not in New Haven or scattered around the state, and those energy bills don't currently go through central facilities. But we felt like as soon as we made exceptions for certain buildings, then everyone looks for how they get into that exception. And so as opposed to opening the door for those, we wanted to just make it very clear, and it was very helpful to have the head of facilities on our task force, and he was pretty explicit in that he really thinks his office can change how that works and can get those numbers and can try to make more of that centralized to make this process easier. So it was helpful to know that we could keep it really simple. So I mentioned the carbon pricing. So if people are interested, we can talk more about this, but essentially there are a lot of different numbers that you could look at and consider when trying to make a price on carbon. A lot of governments have introduced taxes or cap and trade systems that have various carbon prices associated with them. And we considered a lot of them, but it seemed pretty obvious very quickly that if we weren't doing this for revenue, and we were actually doing this to help people cut emissions, that you needed to actually set a high price, which might be a little bit counterintuitive. But a few companies have set really low carbon charge prices from Disney, for example, like Disney. Microsoft is another one. And they're really setting it so low that you're not actually going to incentivize anyone to cut your emissions. They're just using that to raise funds to cover their sustainability initiatives. So I'm stealing humor from Bill Nordhaus, which maybe should be embarrassing. But Yale's carbon charge is not like Disney's. So there are a lot of reasons why we felt like it was important for Yale to do this, and we would advocate for others to consider this as well. I certainly hope, and I think the task force hopes, that in the future this will somewhat be irrelevant, that hopefully we will live in a high carbon price world. There potentially could be federal or state carbon tax initiatives that come across. So hopefully we will just be really ahead of the game, and Yale can really easily transition to that time. We also wanted to sort of demonstrate this and how impactful this can be, help people, give people a blueprint of sort of where to start, and hopefully demonstrate that it's not only feasible, but that it really makes a difference. It's a really different way of viewing how universities can be involved in sort of emissions reduction programs. We heard from a lot of universities. We had a conference with a lot of universities, and people talked about setting zero emissions targets and all these great goals of cutting emissions, and so many of them have to do with offsets. And so one, I think, important thing to mention is that in units getting assessed year after year on their emissions, they will not be allowed to purchase offsets to sort of artificially decrease their emissions. And a big reason for that is that the offset market has a lot of questions associated with it. When you say offset, that means a lot of different things. So you can try to narrow that to saying, no, you have to get gold standard offsets or something like that. But even that has questions. And the actual impact from a carbon emissions perspective is not entirely clear of all those different offset programs. Offsets can also be really cheap. A lot of people can argue that that's not actually reflecting the true price of carbon, and so it just seemed very complicated to include offsets. So we are not including offsets in our program, and we also, in learning about offsets, we're wondering whether really that's the most effective way for universities to meet their targets. Yale as well, we have a target that we are trying to get to, sort of separate from this charge. We've had for a long time an emissions target, and offsets were certainly a part of that strategy. So we really wanted to show that maybe there's a new way that universities can approach these issues. Not that those offsets and target emissions shouldn't simultaneously occur, but perhaps we could give people more options. We also really thought that Yale could take a leadership role in this issue, and that in doing so we could tie this into our broader mission to really justify putting a lot of time and effort into it. And so there's a lot of excitement around that. So as I said, I sort of already went over this, but here are these different options that we could have used. And so we went with the $40 per metric ton, rising at 3% per year plus inflation. So for Yale, using our estimated emissions from 2014, this means that approximately $12 million of charges would have been applied. That does not mean $12 million of revenue. In fact, it doesn't even mean $12 million would have necessarily exchanged hands, but that's how much our emissions would have been valued at. But those who have lower net change year over year or decrease would have received some of the funding, and then those higher charge units would have paid. So what I focused most of my time on was sort of this boundary setting, which I touched on already, which was a little bit more complicated because of all the different entities at Yale. So essentially the other issue with boundary setting is what is actually going to be covered. So I talked about the issues, but the emissions, or the entities rather, the buildings, but the emissions is a little bit more complicated. So what are we actually taxing when we tax these units? So it seemed very clear that scopes 1 and 2, which are energy that Yale directly produces, or emissions from energy Yale directly produces at our central power plant, as well as emissions associated with energy purchased through UI and other utilities, should be included. It seemed like that was a clear boundary that should be set, that those should automatically be included. But then there's scope 3, which is much more complicated. So we separated scope 3 into sort of scope 3A, scope 3B. 3A being, again, using the same terminology of what does Yale have operational control over. So 3A were all emissions that Yale theoretically controls. So university paid for travel, purchasing, so all the equipment that the university purchases, buildings. But then there's scope 3B, so things that are sort of associated with the university, but the university really doesn't have operational control over. So things like that included commuting. Technically, yes, the university could increase parking prices and install more bike racks, but at the end of the day, the university can't actually get you to stop driving your car and isn't actually paying for the fuel that you put in your car to drive to the university. So it's a little more complicated to understand exactly the university's role in that, whereas all things under scope 3A, the university essentially pays for. So that said, it's complicated, but it's not necessarily clear whether or not the charge should include those. What we started out with was we wanted this to be implemented on a pilot scale next year. And in order to do so, let's keep it simple. Let's get it working and up and running. There are going to be a lot of hurdles administratively in terms of how to budget this, who does what, how do we actually administer this charge. And so let's not overly complicate the charge and make the rollout be really problematic. If we have a really smooth rollout, we have all the units functioning and well and incorporating this charge into their day-to-day well, then it'll be a lot easier to add to it. But at the same time, we wanted to strongly emphasize that there are several things under scope 3A that are large emissions categories, air travel being the largest. Part of the reason why we also didn't move forward in including it next year is we in order to charge something, you need to really be confident in those numbers. You need to know what you're charging. So we're really fortunate at Yale that we have a great facilities office and a great sustainability office that have moved forward in doing building specific metering and things like that, so that for scopes 1 and 2, we actually we're pretty far ahead of the game and have pretty good confidence in terms of how we can appropriately charge different units as far as energy goes. But on things like air travel, and we talked about cement use, things like that, we don't have, the data is just not nearly as good. And so trying to implement that right off the bat without being really confident with our data also made us nervous, because you don't want to end up in a situation where people sort of correctly criticize the actual charges that you're passing forward. So instead, our recommendation was to really push forward on some of these Scope 3 initiatives, specifically air travel, and try to get the data and the confidence that we can then move forward with it. So as I said, the charge would be revenue neutral. This has been shown to be very effective in other areas. Even in British Columbia, they actually rebated it all back, but just showing people what their carbon charge would be had a huge impact. So the charge would be levied on a unit's net carbon emissions over its adjusted base level. So essentially the change from year to year is what would be the most important. So this would provide incentives on the margin, as I mentioned, like decreasing the payback period for different projects without really harming the schools. What was going to kill this from the start is if we really financially made it too burdensome for different departments or schools. So just to go through this really quickly, there's a complication with universities in that it's not just administering a charge for all units that look exactly the same. We have some very large schools, like the medical school, that's financially independent from the university as a whole, and then we have a philosophy department within the undergrad or within the university. It's arts and sciences. So how the charge is going to impact these two units and how you try to incentivize them is going to be very different. So we also looked into some sort of behavioral and experimental programs that we could help to make that impactful even for a philosophy department. So we're going to begin phasing this in next year. We are going to sort of try to develop sort of the structure of this program so that it can, again, grow, hopefully with some Scope 3 emissions, and then also include the whole base by the third year. We're going to start with a small subset, a randomly selected subset. And then we're going to evaluate the program, because we think evaluation for continual improvement is really important. So yeah, with that, do you have any questions? That's also my email, so feel free to email me as well.
You explained a lot about the structure sort of behind the scenes, some of the costs
Yeah.
and things, but I don't understand where, how are you, well, first off, what are the units, so we don't have that same terminology as other schools, and then how are you getting the numbers to even know, are you charging like a specific department?
Yeah, so the units is just a vague term because at Yale there's all sorts of different types of units, as I was sort of saying, big and small. So I might not be the best person to answer this, but units as far as like,
A building, a department?
so departments, depending on how so it's based on budgeting. So a unit could be like the School of Management, the School of Forestry, the Divinity School, the Medical School. These are self-support schools at Yale. Or within the Department of Arts and Sciences, there's the Econ department and the History department. My understanding is that each of those would be units. It's based on budgeting, but I actually think that's something that the university is figuring out for those smaller units, exactly what those divides are going to be. So we just use the term unit because you could apply that to your school however makes sense in terms of budget. So it's based on budget, and then within that, how is the energy bill sort of administered? So it's whatever units make the most sense, I think, for you. Yeah, and then the numbers come from the energy bills, the metering, and that's all done through facilities. Yeah.
So in the distribution of the cost, it sounds like, are you comparing to a baseline year or just the previous year? And how do you prevent, if it's just the previous year, how do you prevent, like say Yale School of Forestry has already invested a ton in energy efficiency 5 years back?
Yeah. So that's actually something that I was really concerned with. And so I advocated for a much more complicated charge in which, you know, you get rewarded for past good behavior and past bad behavior is on you, right? Because in a real carbon tax, that's what would happen. But it was just determined, and I'm convinced, and I agree with the decision now, that it's really complicated to actually administer that. And because you would get half the people, at least half of the units, angry that they're being penalized for bad behavior in the past, you know, whether or not they should have known better, it was going to cause a lot more sort of commotion in the rollout. And so the determination was just to look at year over year. But again, I think the important thing to stress is that you're giving people a price to compare projects to. And so even though the School of Forestry will, for example, actually take the hardest hit of anyone at the school because they have been focused for 20 years on carbon emissions reductions and efficiency in their buildings. But potentially with a high price of carbon at $40 price, even projects, even there are projects they haven't done because, you know, a $38 price would be required and they haven't done that, whereas now they might be incentivized to do that. Yeah.
Do you predict that in the next couple of years, if it works out successfully, that you could make it like a more comprehensive charge where you could factor in supplies or different things that do affect carbon emissions?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I certainly hope that in the next few years air travel would be included, but I think it could be, the scope could increase a lot more. Again, I think part of that is data, and then part of that is how to do it in an administratively unburdensome way. So purchasing for a university is, you know, a massive department with a lot of complications, and so you'd want to make sure you could collect that data in a way. But I think, yeah, I think having 3 years of this program implemented successfully will be really important in order to do that. And I think that it's a much stronger case that you can make if you already have a successful program in place. I think we're pretty much out of time, but I just wanted to mention that I think that it's easy to see how perhaps this doesn't incentivize people to do a lot in the day-to-day. But at the same time, what we realized is that really only 5 to 10% of our emissions can be changed on a day-to-day. This is getting people to talk about that, so I think you're still impacting those 5 to 10% that people can impact day-to-day. But sort of more importantly, you're actually setting a really solid price to incentivize people to do larger, more impactful projects. So that's really where I think we'll have the biggest impact. So thank you very much.
All right, thank you very much.